Before the formation of Israel in May 1948, British Mandatory Palestine was in a state of civil war. Palestinian Arab and Israeli Jewish paramilitary forces were fighting throughout the country, aiming to capture and hold territory for their national group. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly had passed Resolution 181, outlining a partition plan for Palestine once the British mandate was terminated. According to this plan, Palestinian territory was allocated for the formation of two new states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, while the city of Jerusalem was to be placed under international trusteeship. This arrangement was accepted by the Jewish leadership, but the Palestinian representatives rejected it on the grounds that it was unfair. Despite Arabs holding a two-third majority by population in Mandatory Palestine, according to the partition plan, almost half the land was assigned to the Jews. The primary Jewish security agency, the Haganah, which later went on to become the IDF, was carrying out Plan D in preparation for establishing the Jewish state. Plan D required the capture of Arab towns and villages located within the borders of the Jewish territory laid out by the UN partition plan. In case of any resistance, the Arab residents were to be expelled, a policy which led to the Palestinian catastrophe, or Nakba. An estimated 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were dispossessed of their homes by Israeli forces. When the State of Israel was declared and the British Mandate came to an end on the 14th and 15th of May 1948, the neighboring Arab states intervened, leading to the First Arab-Israeli War. The armies of Egypt, Transjordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq invaded the newly declared Israeli territory on the 15th of May 1948. Egyptian forces struck from the south, invading the Negev desert and moving north towards Beersheba, as well as occupying territory on the coast in Gaza. The Transjordanian army attacked from the east, capturing territory on the west bank of the Jordan River and also besieging Jerusalem. Syrian and Lebanese forces invaded the northern region of Galilee, but were pushed back, leading to the Israeli capture of this land, which was originally part of the territory awarded to the Palestinians in the partition plan. Ceasefire agreements made in early 1949 brought an end to the First Arab-Israeli War, in which the Jewish state had not only managed to survive, but had also made territorial gains, including Galilee, the Negev desert region, parts of the Mediterranean coastal plain, and the western portion of the city of Jerusalem. Israel now held 3/4 of the former territory of Mandatory Palestine. Of the land left in Arab control, East Jerusalem and the West Bank were occupied and then annexed by Transjordan, while the Gaza Strip was held by Egypt. Arab Palestinians had been dispossessed of their land and left without a state to call their own. Between 1949 and 1956, Palestinian guerrilla units called Fedayeen came up in the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, and the Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip. Cross-border infiltrations were first aimed at returning home or recovering property lost in the civil war, but later grew into attacks on Israeli military and civilian targets. Israel carried out retaliatory strikes, leading to a cycle of violence and terrorism. Fedayeen operations, which were often aided and supported by Egypt, contributed to the outbreak of the next major Arab-Israeli conflict in October 1956, the Suez Crisis, when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal and then blocked Israel's access to the Mediterranean Sea at the Straits of Tiran. The United Kingdom, France, and Israel conspired to make a joint attack on Egypt. The war started with an Israeli invasion of the Sinai Peninsula. Israeli forces advanced into central Sinai and along the Mediterranean coastline, driving the Egyptian army back towards the Suez Canal and isolating the Gaza Strip, which was then invaded and captured. Other Israeli troops headed south, where they captured and reopened the Straits of Tiran. In the meanwhile, British and French airstrikes destroyed or scattered the vast majority of the Egyptian Air Force, leading up to an amphibious assault on the Suez Canal. International pressure from the United States, the USSR, and United Nations led to a ceasefire in November 1956 and prevented the Allied capture of the canal. Israel was forced to withdraw from the Sinai in 1957, and the first United Nations Emergency Force was deployed on a peacekeeping mission to separate the Egyptian and Israeli armies. Tensions between Egypt and Israel rose in May 1967, when Egypt once again announced the closure of the Tiran Straits to all Israeli shipping. Egypt ordered the withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping forces and began to mobilize its army in the Sinai on the border with Israel. Israeli plans involved a decisive preemptive strike on Egypt and Jordan so as to cripple their ability to fight and put the Arabs on the defensive. The primary front of warfare was to the south, against Egypt. On 5th June 1967, the Israeli Air Force launched a massive surprise attack on Egyptian airfields. Unprepared for the airstrikes, the Egyptian Air Force suffered heavy losses and was put out of commission once again, guaranteeing Israeli air supremacy for the rest of the war. The success of the Israeli Air Force was followed by ground invasions of the Sinai and the Gaza Strip. Lacking air support and vulnerable to attacks from Israeli aircraft, the Egyptian army was forced to withdraw through the desert. Israeli forces rushed westwards, bypassing the retreating Egyptians in an attempt to block key roads and mountain passes in western Sinai, so as to trap and then destroy the retreating Egyptian army. As a result of this, thousands of Egyptian soldiers were killed, either in combat or due to lack of supplies in the harsh desert. Thousands more were taken prisoner. Hundreds of vehicles and large quantities of equipment were abandoned as the Egyptian army was broken. By 8th June 1967, Israeli forces had reached the Suez Canal and captured the entire Sinai Peninsula. The Gaza Strip was also placed under Israeli military occupation, a state of affairs which continued until 2005. On the Eastern Front, similar airstrikes were carried out on Jordanian air bases, destroying all of Jordan's air power before Israeli incursions into the West Bank and the encirclement of Jerusalem. Fighting raged over the Holy City until the 7th of June 1967, when the outnumbered and outgunned Jordanian army was forced to withdraw, leaving the West Bank and the entire city of Jerusalem in Israeli hands. To the north, Syrian forces entered the fight by shelling Israeli settlements in Galilee. This was followed by retaliatory bombing by the Israeli Air Force and a full-scale attack on Syrian positions in the Golan Heights by Israeli armored brigades. By the 10th of June, Israel had captured the heights and a ceasefire was then signed. From morning on the 5th of June to the end of the day on the 10th of June, the Third War had been a disaster for the Arab forces and had lasted only 6 days. As a result of this 6-day war, Israel captured and occupied the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Humiliated by Israel's success in the 6-day war, the Arab states resolved to carry on the fight, deciding that there would be no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. This led to the War of Attrition from 1967 to 1970, a period of irregular warfare along the Suez Canal between Egypt and Israel, where Egypt aimed to wear the Israeli position down and pressurize them to return the occupied Sinai. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict bore no fruit, and as a result, Egypt started to prepare its military forces for another full-scale war with Israel, equipped this time with modern equipment, aircraft, and vehicles supplied by the Soviet Union. As Egyptian and Syrian forces mobilized on the Israeli borders in late September 1973, war seemed inevitable. Hoping to avoid the breakout of another conflict in the Middle East, the US and USSR each pressured their allies, Egypt and Israel, not to make the first hostile move. However, on October 6, 1973, the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, Egyptian and Syrian forces entered Israeli territory in Sinai and the Golan Heights simultaneously in a surprise attack. The Egyptian army overran the fortifications of the Israeli Bar Lev line on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal, making early territorial gains before being halted by Israeli counterattacks. At the same time, Syrian and Israeli forces were engaged in heavy fighting over the Golan Heights, with Israel managing to push the Syrians back and then launching a counteroffensive into Syrian territory. On the Sinai front, the Israeli army broke the impasse by crossing the Suez Canal into Egyptian territory and threatening to encircle Egyptian forces on the canal's east bank. This led to a ceasefire agreement on the 25th of October and a disengagement agreement in May 1974, by the terms of which Israel withdrew its forces west of the canal. In the 1978 Camp David Accords which followed, Israel returned the entire occupied Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, leading to the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty. Egypt therefore became the first Arab nation to formally recognize Israel and ended the state of war between the two countries.